Our murderess du jour is one that hasn't been talked about much and isn't one of the more well-known poisoners. Then I started trying to research her, and I might have discovered why not too many people are talking about her. Every time I start to research for an episode of Laced, I feel a little bit overwhelmed. But then once I start digging into the story, everything smooths out and I have a pretty good outline of the poisoner. This episode's poisoner isn't like that. So some of the facts of her story aren't facts at all, but rather assumptions and sometimes even guesses. I've dug through old newspapers, court documents, genealogical records, and I still have a lot of blanks in the fill in the blanks. So please bear with me as I attempt to tell the story of Margaret Meyer Lynch Jones Fairfax Corzine Merritt Summers, a serial bride and a serial killer. Welcome to, or welcome back to, the Agatha May Detective Agency. I'm Agatha May, and I'm just tickled almost to death that you're here for another episode of Laced. As I said in the intro, this episode has a lot more guessing than hard fact. I have attempted to make the guesses educated, but this woman uses random ages and surnames on her documents. She lied about how many times she'd been married, and lied about who she married when. Following her trail was like a drunk, blind guppy trying to find that last piece of fish flake in the bowl. Margaret Meyer was born in 1885, or a year on either side of it. Her parents were William W. and Elizabeth Meyer. Elizabeth died sometime between Margaret's birth and 1889, and I wonder if she died giving birth to Margaret. Margaret was raised by her father and stepmother Mary, who married her father sometime before 1889. At least I think that date is correct. I learned next to nothing about Margaret's childhood, other than she lived in Effingham, Illinois. Effingham is about an hour and a half northeast of St. Louis and was a main railroad hub. It was originally named Broughton, but was renamed in 1859 when it became the county seat. The name Effingham was thought to be in honor of an English earl, but I like to think it was named by someone who absolutely detested pork products. Margaret's father worked for the railroad, which is probably why they lived in Effingham. Her stepmother kept house and made babies. She brought two of her own children to the marriage and then had six more. But she also helped raise another seven that were William's before he married her. That's 15 children in all, if you do the math right, and it might be the reason that Margaret left home when she was 16 and moved to Chicago. According to the story Margaret would later tell detectives in a Chicago jail cell, she married James Fairfax when she was 16, had a daughter named Catherine, who died at the age of 7, and then James died soon after. Then, according to Margaret, she lived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for a while and worked in a factory there. She returned to Chicago and married Thomas Shaggs Summers on April 2nd, 1926. Shaggs was a huckster, which back in the 30s just meant he sold cheap items door to door, kind of a traveling dollar store. A lot of hucksters had a Model A that had a roll-up cover on a back window, and they would hawk their wares from it. Some just went door to door. However, according to Mags, old Shaggs was lazy and hired other hucksters out to huck for him, or whatever they called it. I'm not sure that's lazy as much as it is entrepreneurial, though. But I guess Margaret had enough of Shaggs being around the house all the time, and on August 9th, 1930, he died. His cause of death was listed as tuberculosis, and his death was one of two that precipitated a lot of trouble for Margaret. The other was the death of her nephew, Thomas Meyer. In mid-May of 1931, police were informed by family members of Shaggs that they were pretty sure Margaret had murdered him. At the same time, family members of Margaret's told police that they thought she had murdered her nephew Thomas. With two different families coming at them yapping about how Margaret was murdering people left and right, the police decided they needed to investigate. So they did. And by May 22nd, 1931, Margaret had been arrested on suspicion of 4 deaths: Shaggs, Thomas, and 2 of their boarders, William Ryman and Thomas Lanigan. Her nephew Thomas was the 17-year-old son of her brother Louis. Thomas was living with Margaret because both of his parents had died. And I'm beginning to wonder if she possibly killed both of them as well as their other three children. Louis and his family lived in Chicago, and it seems as if they were at least close enough to Margaret that their son ended up living with her. Thomas was their oldest child. Their second son, Arthur, died in 1918 and was only a year old. His cause of death was listed as gastroenteritis. Another son, Louis, was only 11 months old when he died in 1920. His cause of death was bronchitis and diarrhea. A daughter, Mary, was a month old when she died in 1922, and her cause of death was also gastroenteritis. Lewis's wife, Hazel, died in 1925 at the age of 34 from lobar pneumonia. Lewis's death was in 1928, and his cause of death was tuberculosis. And authorities at the time thought maybe that Margaret had helped him along. In another episode of Laced, I talked about how arsenic poison can cause lung ailments and definitely can cause gastroenteritis. Now, it won't cause TB, but it can make someone more susceptible to contracting it. It is just so strange to me that the entire family was wiped out and died from either a lung disease or a stomach ailment. And I could understand if this was the late 1800s, but by the 1930s, medicine was just a bit better. But Lewis wasn't the only brother who died quickly. Their brother, John, came to Chicago for Lewis's funeral and stayed with Margaret. Lewis's death was on August 1st, and by the 3rd, John was ill. He died 3 days later, and his cause of death was lobar pneumonia. Did Margaret kill John? I'm going to say probably so. Thomas's organs were tested and came back positive for arsenic. The bodies of Shaggs and the two boarders were exhumed and were also tested, and they also came back positive for arsenic. And why would Margaret kill a 17-year-old? Well, it wasn't bloodlust or because he upset her. It was because of life insurance policies. 6 of them, all taken out by Margaret, and depending on which newspaper article you believe, the policies netted her what would be between $55,000 and $75,000 in today's money. I guess she never thought that 6 policies on a normally healthy 17-year-old was suspicious at all. Life insurance was the same reason she'd killed her brother Louis, Shaggs, and the 2 boarders. They all had policies with Margaret as the beneficiary. I thought about naming this episode Shaggs to Riches. While the investigators knew Margaret had used arsenic to kill her victims, they didn't know how she procured it. An exhaustive search of chemists in the area led nowhere. So at the time when anyone bought arsenic in its pure form, they had to sign a ledger with the chemist. And investigators couldn't find Margaret's name on a single ledger indicating that she'd purchased poisons. However, detectives finally learned that Margaret had sent a friend of her nephew's to pick up some flypaper for her at different times. And flypaper back then had arsenic in it. Margaret specified that she needed the flypaper with the arsenic in it. Authorities surmised that old Mag soaked the paper to extract the poison and then put the liquid in a cup of tea or 20. Margaret sat in jail until February of the next year before her trial began. And while she was waiting, the detectives were doing something that I'm sure was useful. But much as it is today, it was everyday people that provided the most information to them. Margaret's stepmother, Mary, showed up to let the police know that Margaret had a few more husbands than she'd led investigators to believe. Her first husband wasn't James Fairfax, he was her third. Her inaugural husband was James Lynch. She was only 16 when they married in 1900, so she lied on her marriage certificate and said she was 18. Mary also told police that Margaret had had a daughter with James Lynch that died when she was 3 years old, and then James died a couple of years after. I couldn't find any record of that daughter, but I did find a 3-month-old boy who was born to a James and Margaret Meyer Lynch, who was born in 1903 and died 3 months later. His name was Thomas. I also found that James Lynch died in 1905, so it's possible the stepmother had them backwards, that the baby died first and James died second. And according to one of her sisters, Margaret rarely visited any of her family back in Effingham, so keeping a child hidden from them wouldn't have been too difficult. Margaret then married Leonard Jones on June 3, 1906 in St. Joseph, Michigan. Leonard was Canadian and a Mason, by trade, not by induction. In 1910, he and Margaret were on the census and were living in Chicago with a daughter named Margaret. And we'll talk about where she came from in a minute or two. I couldn't find a death record for Lenny, so maybe he just divorced Margaret, or Lenny might have hot stepped it back to Canada in the hopes of finding a wife who wasn't quite so murdery. Maybe Margaret figured that since the marriage was in a different state, divorce wasn't necessary and she could just marry someone else in Illinois, which is what she did. On February 4th, 1916, Margaret married James Fairfax. And poor Jimmy only lasted until June of that year before he departed this earth. The cause of death listed on his death certificate was tuberculosis. Another marriage that Margaret failed to mention to investigators was that to Stanley Corzin on March 6, 1917. Stanley lived until October 11th of that same year, and his death was more likely by Margaret's hand. But wait, there's more. Margaret then married Warren Merritt on Valentine's Day in 1921. Margaret's stepmother said that Margaret had killed Warren as well, but Margaret's daughter said that Warren had done RUNNOFT with some younger woman. And I think the daughter was correct because Warren didn't die until 1960. And that makes me think that perhaps Margaret's next marriage wasn't necessarily legal due to her already being married to Warren. And her final marriage, at least that I could find, was the marriage to Shag Summers. And even when confronted with the truth about how many times she'd been married, she still tried to deny some of the marriages until she was shown proof. And then she admitted it, but begrudgingly. I think Margaret wanted to keep him a secret because she didn't want the authorities to know that there might be some more deaths with her name attached to them. I never found any proof of any Catherine having been born to Margaret. And with Margaret going through husbands quicker than she went through her dime store stockings, I have a hard time believing that she actually went from 1906 until 1916 without being married to anyone else. Now, this was supposed to have been in her years of Wisconsin wandering, but I have to wonder how many weddings she wandered into during that time. Margaret wasn't without supporters during the investigation. There were a whole two of them. One was a former boarder who Margaret hadn't killed, and the other was her daughter named Margaret. Well, she referred to her as her adopted daughter. So was that the Margaret that was on the 1910 census when Margaret was married to Leonard? Well, I did some digging, and the daughter's middle name was Violet, so that's what I'll call her just to keep the confusing things less confusing. And Violet wasn't adopted. She was Margaret's biological daughter. Margaret had given birth to her on August 13th, 1905, and the father of the child was James Fairfax, the man Margaret didn't marry until 1916. Violet stood by her mother through the trial and even after, and I wonder if she ever knew that Margaret was her biological mother. And I'm guessing that Margaret referred to her as her adopted daughter so no one would know that she'd had a baby out of wedlock. At the end of May of that same year, police raided Margaret's apartment and found it almost entirely empty. They were told by another tenant in the building that Violet and her husband had shown up the night before and cleaned it out. One item the police did find was a family Bible, and in it, Margaret had written the names of her victims with their death dates, and neatly pinned beside those dates were the total amounts of insurance she had on each. They also discovered that in all, Margaret had taken out 19 life insurance policies. 6 of those were on her nephew, so she had 13 other people insured, and only 5 of them were still alive: her daughter, grandchildren, and a former boarder. Margaret was only on trial for the murder of her nephew. Perhaps the prosecution chose that particular murder since it would be a lot more difficult for Margaret to try and claim self-defense as an excuse for killing a 17-year-old than it would be if they tried her for her husband's murder. Her trial was a quick affair. The jury was chosen on Wednesday, February 24th, 1932, and by the following Tuesday, the jury gave a verdict and a sentence. The only witness for the defense was Margaret herself. She told the court that she didn't know how any of the deaths occurred and that she'd only purchased the flypaper because she was making beer and there were little flies everywhere. She said she only made the second order of flypaper because she'd misplaced the first one. Sure, Margaret, we believe you. Margaret said that the reason this whole ordeal was happening was because she was just too good to people. And I suppose if causing their terribly horrific deaths is being too good to them, then Margaret was just a downright saint. A toxicologist testified that he tested 3 sheets of flypaper and was able to extract about 2.5 grains of arsenic from them. 3 grains can be a fatal dose for an adult. Each package of flypaper had 6 sheets, and Margaret had at least 5 packages. So 30 sheets for a total of 25 grains of arsenic, or a little over 8 fatal doses. When the jury went to deliberate on the morning of Tuesday, March 1st, they were only out about 3 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, it was with a guilty verdict for Margaret and a sentence of 14 years in prison. Margaret seemed to be relieved the trial was over. She was formally sentenced by the judge on March 11th, and he told her had the sentencing been up to him, she would have received a harsher sentence. So I guess yay for Margaret for murdering people somewhere the jury got to choose her sentence. Margaret would spend the next 14 years at the Oakdale Reformatory for Women in Dwight, Illinois. I was able to trace Margaret after her conviction, but only to the time she was in prison. She shows on the 1940 census as being at the reformatory, and after that I've lost her. I haven't found an obituary for her, at least not under the name Margaret Summers or Margaret Meyer. That's not to say she didn't get married again another 10 times, though. I did find a Margaret that could be our murderess on the 1950 census. And this particular Margaret owned a confectionery shop. And I can't help but wonder if somewhere out there on a long forgotten shelf, there's a box from Margaret's candy shop, tied with a faded pink satin bow, holding pastel fruit drops that have just a hint of arsenic and the dusting of powdered sugar on top. Thank you so much for sticking through the entirety of Margaret's mess. I swear this woman had me wanting to drink poison of the liquid variety while I was figuring out her timelines of marriages. I'll be back with more true crime, and we'll have another episode of Lace soon. Until then, stay safe and be happy.